traditional music and how this related to his role as a police officer. So it's a great pleasure to have Mike here speak to us today. I'm going to pass over to you.
It's a truly great pleasure to be here. I'm really enjoying it, and it's a thrill for me. So there's the man himself. This picture adorned all of his books. He put it at the frontispiece of all his books. He was very proud of his police authority. He's proud of his police career, and rightly so. It was a brutal slog to go from patrolman to chief of police, and it involved an enormous, mind-boggling amount of favor dispensing and sort of corrupt. Chicago is a den of corruption, if ever that cliche applied. He's a troubling figure to write about in some ways because in the Irish traditional music community, he's kind of a Santa Claus figure. He's sort of the magical bestower of niceness. I had a well-known Belfast musician really angry at me for this book, for trying to cancel Francis O'Neill, which I don't think it does, although it's critical of him. Anyway, this is where he was born. I'm going to go briefly through his life. He's born in Trallbane or Trallybon in Cork near Bantry. This is the family homestead. They were prosperous tenants. They leased more than 100 acres. He was the youngest of a family of 6. They wanted him to be a priest because he was bookish and scholarly by inclination. He wanted no part of that. He wrote about how he didn't end up becoming a priest or a Christian brother in the most insanely garbled and confused way. He gave multiple versions of it. None of them make a lick of sense. But he shipped as a cabin boy on a boat that was going to England, and then became an itinerant sailor for 4 years. He circumnavigated the globe. He came to the United States first as a steward on a ship called Emerald Isle, which told Irish immigrants that they were not fleeing destitution, but rather heroically continuing a colonizing mission. He met his wife on that ship. From New York, he did a few other voyages, and he got on a clipper, then went to Japan, to Yokohama, and then to San Francisco, and then to Hawaii, and then he was put on a boat that was shipping guano, bird droppings, from a place called Baker Island, which actually exists and which was 2 to 3 feet deep in centuries of bird droppings. And his ship was dashed on the rocks, and he was shipwrecked there for more than a week, near starvation, very close to starvation, because there's no trees, no food, no nothing but bird droppings and birds, which he said were inedible. And the figurehead of the ship survives miraculously in the Museum of Colonial Williamsburg in Williamsburg, Virginia. That's the figurehead of the Minnehaha. He herded sheep in the Sierra Nevada foothills for a while, sleeping outdoors for 7 months. He lived for a small time, for a year in the town of Medina, Missouri, which was a Catholic colony. It was promoted specifically to bring Catholics to this good land before the Protestants gobble it all up, as newspapers were saying. He taught school there, taught math. He didn't stay for long, though. He married this woman who we'd met on the Emerald Isle, and they went to Chicago. Anna Rogers. There's a famous reel in Irish traditional music called Julia Delaney that's named after her sister. He had 10 children. 6 of them died in childhood before the age of 4. His oldest son died at 18. If you read I've read everything he wrote, he's extremely emotionally terse, extremely, very withholding of his emotions. He rarely talks about the grief that must have come from this. He rarely talks. When he leaves home at 17, he never says, oh, I missed my family, I missed my mother. He never says a word about any of that. He's very emotionally withholding, very intelligent, good sense of humor in a dry way. He was sort of the straight man for the Chicago press, and they loved him for that. He didn't drink, smoke, or gamble. I'd speculate that he might be described as neurodivergent or on the spectrum. He had an insatiable memory for tunes and a vast capacity for tunes. He also had a tendency to kind of alienate his friends a little bit. Here he is appointed. He rose steadily from patrolman to chief of police. And here's 3 cartoons that sort of express the arc of his political career. Typically, the chief of police was a 1-year gig because it was a favor bestowed on some faction of aldermen and judges and local saloon owners. He got 3 terms. He resigned during the 3rd term for political reasons he didn't speak of. But in the first, he's heroically going to reform the disaster left by his predecessor, Kipley. In the second, the cleaning out is not taking place, and the newspaper is wondering why. It's because Bobby Burke, the head of the Illinois Democratic Party, is blocking it. And then in this one, he's blessing his children in the Levy district, was the notorious Vice District of Chicago. He's blessing his children and saying, you can keep going for a while, no change is forthcoming. And that was a fairly traditional arc. They would always enter as heroes of reform, and reform would quickly fade. He wrote, most notably, these books. His first collection, O'Neill's Music of Ireland, 1903, a collection of 1,850 distinct tunes. Shortly after he retired, he published Dance Music of Ireland, which is maybe his most famous. It's strictly instrumental dance tunes. And then he published 2 books of histories of Irish musicians and music collecting. And then his last book was a collection of Irish and Scottish melodies. There's a statue of him down in Bantry, near Bantry. You can go see it. It's not a particularly well-sited statue. And that's Chief O'Neill's Pub in Chicago, which is quite a nice pub, a very successful, big, thriving enterprise. And I was drawn to him because he was pivotal to a lot. I'm a historian of the late 19th and early 20th century, and he was pivotal to a lot of events in that period. He was a cop during the Haymarket riot, when anarchists were alleged to have blown up the police during a meeting. He was a major figure in the Pullman strike, which was the largest strike in American history, where the federal government sent the US Army to put down the strike. He was quite frank about his role in that strike on behalf of corporations. In fact, he's appointed to his last term specifically to break a strike by Teamsters. And he was known to authority. As a cop, who are you going to pick? You could pick the local alderman as your ally. The alderman probably ran a saloon, and in return for not looking at illegal activities, you got a job on the police force. You could ally yourself with a union leader who was very likely to be an Irish American, or you could decide to ally yourself with the city's corporations, which is what O'Neill frankly says he did. He saved the anarchist Emma Goldman from being tortured by the Chicago police, and she writes about that in her biography, that she's being really tortured by a guy who later becomes O'Neill's assistant chief. And O'Neill comes in and sets her loose. He says, I don't think you had anything to do with assassinating President McKinley. I'm going to let you go. And she's surprised by his gentlemanly tone, and this is often taken as a sign of his fundamental decency, which he probably had. He was involved in the Iroquois Theater fire. He was almost the first on site. This was a big, lavish theater. 600 people died in the fire that broke out, and the safety measures didn't work, and people couldn't get out. And I was just stunned by this. I'm going on too long. He got there early and spent his whole night there, this cold winter night, trying to rescue people. He got to the second floor, people couldn't get out, and they all died. They were stacked 6 to 8 deep, the bodies of people. And worse, they could hear people alive underneath the piles. So the police were desperately trying to disentangle them. And he told a reporter, they said, what was it like, Chief? And he said, if you have ever seen a field of timothy grass blown flat by a summer storm, that was the position of the bodies at the second level, which I thought was a really striking rural memory, probably related to growing up in Ireland and his family's farm. And I think in that moment of stress, he thought back to that. So it's an interesting life on a lot of levels. It's an immigrant success story, story of urban industrial life. It's a story of culture making. He's a guy who has a major figure in forming the canon of Irish traditional music. And it's a story about transatlantic movements of people and ideas, transnational movements, because he's probably more of a hero and more influential in Ireland than he is in the United States. I'm not really convinced he saved Irish music in the United States. I think it would have gone just fine without him. So Irish music, if you don't know it, I grew up in an Irish American family. People unimaginatively marrying other Irish Americans despite the rich stew of ethnic options available in the United States. But Irish music wasn't part of my upbringing. And to do this book, I thought I had to teach myself to learn to play it so I can huff and puff through some tunes on a flute. Irish music it's folk music. Tunes don't have standard names. They often have multiple names. So the Cash Jig is played to the Port of Paris of this a lot at music sessions, has a lot of different names. In O'Neill's, it's known as the Mountaineer's March and also the Spring Well, but it's basically the same tune. And this is true of almost every tune. And here what I want to get to, the key of what I want to get to here, is that there's a different mentality involved here, a really different subjectivity or epistemology. I keep looking for fancy Latinate words to get to this. I know maybe 100 tunes. I'm a duffer, but I know enough so that I can't remember how the tune I know starts Or in the middle of one tune, I play the second part of a different tune, and I go, what the hell? What did I just do? And I was worried about this, worried that it was the first stage of dementia, but it's actually the sort of preferred state of being in Irish traditional music. And a friend of mine in Chicago refers to it as the cloud of possibility. You want to have enough sort of internal that lots of things can happen. And I was at a session last night in Belfast, and I asked these guys, what was that tune you just played? And none of them knew. I don't know. We just play it. This is a tune that O'Neill, it first goes into print in O'Neill's collection. And here's an attempt to trace its ancestry and put down different recorded versions. This is a well-used website. It has different names for the song in Irish and in English and a key. And so you can address different ways of playing it. The point I want to make is that Irish music is unruly. It's really unruly. It's customary. It's larded with custom, but it's not rule-bound. It's not ruleful. And it was played, I know, certainly I know lots of people sort of cringe about Irish traditional music. I did, because for me, it was associated with unexamined forms of authenticity, right? Possibly racist exclusions. I had all sorts of negative feelings about it. It's embarrassingly maybe old-fashioned or backward or rural for a lot of people, played by disreputable people. My friend Martha Cook, I want to promote this a little bit. She did a great article in Reviews in Irish Study Review, I think. It's curated by Connor McCabe, who's here. And the other guy who expressed this really well is your late colleague, Kieran Carson, who in his book, Last Night's Fun, really gets at this sort of memory fog of Irish music. He gets at it really well, this sort of experience of not knowing exactly what it is you're doing and having the thing you're doing appear. It's similar to what you'd experience improvising in jazz. It's not unique to Irish music. But I want to quote some of O'Neill's language about a piper that he located in Ireland named Jem Byrne. Called it a real live piper and a good one of a species thought to be extinct. He was forthwith installed in suitable quarters to teach his precious art to aspiring youngsters, but the call of the wild was too much for him. The microbe of vagrancy was too active in his blood. Those who tried to work with him could appreciate the feelings of a man who had undertook to domesticate wild ducks. And he ends up saying that what we need is a piper with a good instrument, temperate and self-respecting in his habits. A musician of that character would be a musical missionary whose vocation would be no less appreciated in the community than profitable to himself. He wants to install him like a gas appliance, punching a clock, teaching regularly, and not wandering the country drinking in pubs as payment for his music. He's an unruly character, and O'Neill's vision here is turning him into a ruly character. And that's not necessarily bad. I would like Mr. Byrne to make a good living and have dignity, but imagine that language coming from, say, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, an agent in the Bureau of Indian Affairs talking about Native Americans, or a British colonial administrator. There's both affection for the music, but also it's dripping with a kind of disdain for the lifestyle this guy lives, and he has a desire to discipline him into a person of regular and virtuous habits. That is to make him ruly. So I was really struck by the fact the single most influential collection of Irish music comes from O'Neill, who is entirely professionally dedicated to the enforcement of rules, laws and civic codes formalized in statute books. Here's a cartoon where O'Neill is arresting the small gambler while the big gamblers on the Chicago Board of Trade go unpunished. So that tension between ruly and unruly really struck me. And I'm going to quote this. I'm going to read from a poem now. If I had found this poem when I was writing the O'Neill book, I never would have written the damn book, because the poem expressed what I was trying to get at with such concision. This is by Michael Donaghy, who was born in the Bronx to Irish immigrant parents, studied at the University of Chicago, was a well-regarded poet, won the Whitbread Prize, lived in London, died young. Martin Dowling knew him. This is a poem about O'Neill called A Reprieve. It starts with a quote from O'Neill's Irish folk music, A Fascinating Hobby. And that's how O'Neill wrote. The writer, that is me, decided to have them preserved in musical notation. And here in Chicago, it's almost gone and quiet in the cell in the Dearden Street Station House, apart from the first words in the window. Why am I reading what you can read? You can clearly read it. You're all capable of it. Now, O'Neill, I would say, in his defense, never used bigoted language. There's no evidence that he was a racist, as so many Americans of his day were, except he would talk about the Irish race casually, or the musical genius of the Irish race, but he wasn't a pernicious racist. He probably would not have used Chinaman, but think it over, he says, and don't take all day. Nolan's hands are brown with the Chinaman's blood. But if he agrees to play 3 jigs slowly, so O'Neill can take them down, he can walk home, change clothes, and disappear to the stockyards across the tracks. O'Neill's going to let him go if he can extract those tunes. And this, to me, is the key piece. Nolan can't phrase a jig the same way twice. He doesn't do it that way. That's not how his practice works. He's not a trained musician. He plays a jig at a party. He plays it as an entertainment piece. He actually struggles to play it slowly, and he struggles to play it the same way twice. And you can see this in people. They don't want to do that. It's not natural. It's foreign to the practice of folk music. And O'Neill needs him to do that so he can write the tune down. And that, to me, is an interesting, I think what Donaghy caught here is something O'Neill complained about all the time. He wanted to collect music. Musicians didn't want to share them. He complained about it all the time. They didn't want to give up their tunes. He wanted to know, oh, that's a new tune. What is that? Play it for me slowly so I can write it down or so I can memorize it. And they didn't want to do it. Chicago was an unruly place, so his interest in rules made sense. This is Archer Avenue in Bridgeport. He lived near here in his first home in Chicago. This is in the 1870s. You can see it's still dirt. The streets are still mud. Chicago grows incredibly quickly. It's a boom town. It's like Mexico City or Mumbai. It grows from a small place to just booming. It's intensely dynamic, intensely innovative, extremely violent. I was going to lead with Chicago as a deeply violent sectarian city, and then it hit me that I was speaking in Belfast, and I turned course quickly. There's a cartoon by an artist named Harry Grant Dart satirizing Chicago in 1906, and the policeman is walking arm in arm with the corrupt alderman who runs a gambling house. Crime is rampant, but so is huge amounts of money. Johnny Rockefeller is funding Rockefeller, University of Chicago. It's a scene of dynamism and corruption. The wind is blowing through. Chicago's nicknamed the Windy City, not because it's actually windy, but because it was full of self-promotion. People were windy and oratorical in their self-promotion. O'Neill multiple times defended the torture of suspects. And here he is saying that, this is to the his 1904 annual report. The stomach pump is a technique the police would use where they would stick a tube in somebody's mouth and force water into them to the point where their stomach was distended, and then stomp on their stomach or punch them to force the water out again. And it was commonly used. And here he is defending it. And the context for this is 1903. There's a major controversy, 1904, in the United States over the conduct of American soldiers in the Philippines in the Spanish-American War, who were engaging in this exact practice to torture Philippine insurrectionaries, people who are trying to gain independence for Philippines. And here he is telling the Chicago Tribune that the police are justified in stretching the law to its limit because they do so in a good cause. And I want to make this point here. O'Neill's musical legacy is important, but the city of Chicago has chronic problems with police violence, chronic and ongoing. O'Neill's son-in-law led the police in what's known as the Memorial Day Massacre. His son-in-law, Captain James Mooney, this opened fire on a crowd of strikers, killing 10, injuring dozens, all shot in the back as they fled the police. This man, between 1972 and 1991, tortured at least 118 suspects to the point where the United Nations issued a specific condemnation of the Chicago police force. So if we're going to celebrate his musical legacy, which we should, he was unprecedented in the amount of time he served as a chief at that point. So he was an influential person. And we have to consider that the legacy of the Chicago police also includes that. Now, this is not to say he's a bad person. I don't think he was. I don't think he liked torture. He said police work was rough and repulsive to the man of refined sensibilities, which he had. It was harsh, corrupt, vicious, and the sordid sides of life, so policemen yield to the unwholesome influences. But here's his description of his behavior during the Pullman strike. Now, you know, it's not against the law to yell insults at the police. It's not a good idea. I'm not advising it, but it's not against the law. It's not a crime. And he was boasting about the fact that they just burst into that saloon and terrified the occupants and beat them. So all that is to point out that Donaghy is not wrong to emphasize the slap of the billy club in O'Neill's poem, in that poem. And he's not wrong to emphasize the coercive aspects of his whole career, including to some extent his musical work. Now, he genuinely loved the music, and he often genuinely loved musicians. That's absolutely true. I want to say violence is not all there was. He's also part of, you know, Max Weber's information revolution. He's deeply enmeshed in that, the information revolution. As chief of police, he's administering a very large industrial city. This is statistics from his annual reports. He's got indexes of what crimes are committed. He's got a breakdown by ethnicity. You'll be surprised to see the Germans are way ahead of the Irish in the number of crimes they're committing. I was surprised. That he has to compile these every year. They have to compile statistics on recidivism. They want to study what's effective in stopping recidivism. The Chicago police, when he entered the police force, they were the ambulance service. They were the homeless shelter. During the winters in Chicago, police stations were full of people sleeping on the floor because they had no place to go. You can find accounts of that. He was also really interested in forensic identity tracking. And I think this is the most important part. Chicago was one of the 2 leading cities in the United States in taking mugshots, or forming what they call a rogues gallery, taking pictures of suspects to try and identify them. These are pictures from the Joliet prison, which Chicago fed into. And he worked a lot with this man, Captain Michael Evans. And here he's describing how often he worked with Evans, taking pictures of thugs. This is one of my sins that has not been found out, he said, when it was revealed. Evans, there's a grisly picture on the website of Evans holding the head of a dead man as part of a demonstration of forensic identity tracking. Evans, in this article, talks about how he can see the past of people. The point I want to make is that the mugshot is a kind of prosthetic memory device. It's a physical extension of the personal memory, and it allows him to remember people who he might otherwise forget. Evans actually patented an album for recording. The problem with mugshots is, how do you cross-reference them? They're hard to organize. How do you do that? And he patented a book to do that. I don't know how effective it was, but O'Neill was very involved, and here the press is satirizing that because O'Neill is part of a team of people trying to get the grafter to be photographed for the rogues gallery. You often see in mugshots, books of mugshots from the 19th century, you see the guy sitting there looking very unhappy with 2 hands on either side of his head, and that's the policeman holding his head in place so he can't thwart the camera. Or you see people making goofy faces to try and distort the record of themselves, and that's what's being described here. There's the chief. Often with the fedora, that was sort of his trademark. Now, mugshots were unreliable. They were much less reliable than you might think. And this is in the collections of the Chicago Historical Museum, police photographs of this. Is this the same guy or not? And I think it probably is, but partly because he's wearing the same clothes. Would you send this man to the gallows based on this similarity? Right? Maybe you would, and maybe you wouldn't. But mugshots are not reliable. People change, they grow facial hair, they're not as reliable as you think they would be. So they resort to other things. And one of them is called the Bertillon system, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. Bertillon, who's a French policeman who was obsessed with finding things about the body that did not change over time. So your face changes, you gain weight, you lose weight, you grow facial hair, etc. But the length from your elbow to the tip of your longest finger will not change, or the width of your head won't change, or the degree of your pupils apart will not change, or the length of your toe. And Bertillon developed these really complicated indexes for identifying people. He was convinced that if you did it right, you could get eyes. There were indexes for ear shape and there were indexes for eye color. You could transmit a telegraphic portrait of a suspect And you'd say, we have a suspect here in Chicago, and you send it to Philadelphia, and here are his Bertillon numbers, and they would be able to recreate his face from those numbers because they were a telegraphic portrait. And there were other systems. This one I love because it's sort of comic relief. This is the Chicago patrolman who wanted to give policemen an easier way to remember the person they saw commit a crime. And they would take these different nose shapes and head shapes, and they could reassemble a portrait of the person who committed the crime. I actually did it. There, he looks pretty suspect. But it's not a cat, but the Bertillon system here, in Joliet prison, they're taking Bertillon measurements. They've got a caliper in that one. They're measuring the width of his head, which he's not going to be able to fudge. And they're measuring his seated height. They're measuring the width from elbow to index finger, and they're measuring a different way there. They're measuring his feet. Bertillon had different instruments for doing that. The heart of it, of course, is this. This is the memory bank of the Bertillon system, the files. This is from a display that Bertillon did at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, which was about 4 blocks from O'Neill's house, and which he went to many times. There were two, not one, but two Irish villages, which both had 3/4 scale models of Irish landmarks. There was a Blarney Castle and a Donegal Castle. There were comely maidens weaving and thatched huts and the smell of burning turf. And he went to both of them because he was interested in the musicians who were playing. Here's a Bertillon card. And the numbers are up top, along with the mugshot. Here's another one. And they continued in the States. Fingerprints sort of supplanted them fairly quickly. By 1920, fingerprints were more common. They were less cumbersome. But the Bertillon system is widely used, particularly in New York and Chicago. And here's some evidence of his enthusiasm for it. So they've made almost 12,000 photographs from 2,500 negatives, so they can cross-reference them and figure out who is who. And of course, you have to do this. It's a big city. The scale of it won't allow human memory to function very well. You have to build these prosthetic memory systems that allow you to expand human memory. Sort of like this, right? This is a prosthetic memory system that allows you to expand memory and gives you an index of different versions of this tune. Here's some examples of O'Neill teaching forensic identity tracking. And he did a sort of summer school for other police forces. Now, I want to relate this. So O'Neill, his collecting, he did music collecting his whole life, or music memorizing. It's not entirely clear when he started doing the serious formal collection. I think it's when he's captain, because he has enough authority to do it. But he was outed. This was sort of secret. He was outed to the public. It's a well-known anecdote of his life. Somebody called the police stations and the newspapers in Chicago saying, Chief O'Neill's not in his office. He's been kidnapped. We can't find him. And it was front page news. O'Neill's in the newspaper every day. It was front page news right away. Where's the chief? Has he been kidnapped by anarchists? There's anarchist panic was a regular tool of demagoguery in America. And it didn't take long to find him. He was at the home of Sergeant James O'Neill, no relation, who was one of his collaborators in music collecting. And they found him there playing the flute while O'Neill, who was a Belfast man, James O'Neill, Belfast man, was fiddling away. There was an attempt, I think, to embarrass him. Why isn't he doing his job? The press really liked it. They found it charming. They liked it about him. And not long after that, the Tribune ran a really interesting article that described his collecting activities. It's often pointed out, rightly, that he's got people from every county in Ireland that he can collect from. And he has, under his authority, a police force of several thousand men. And they can go around the city. And I heard some guy playing Irish music. We ought to check it out. And that's what he does. So he has a team of people, about 24 people. More than half of them are either his subordinates on the police force or somebody he helped get a job. So it's a very police-inflected activity. And here's how the reporter wrote it up, or one of the ways he wrote it up. If he wants to run down air or a jig, he's on the lookout for it. They'll pick it up. The elusive fugitive air is captured. He cannot rest. He has in this matter 1,400 different melodies. So clearly, the reporter sees a similarity between his police activity and his music collecting. And he himself said many times that he could not have done it without the authority of the badge, or the prestige of rank, or the ability to dispense favors and patronage. He has an anecdote about a woman who wouldn't share some tunes she knew, and he shows up in the full captain of the superintendent of police saying, "Do you want to think about sharing those tunes?" And she says, "Oh yeah, I guess I do." And she does. Under no other conditions would it be possible to induce such musicians as I've had to deal with to give up their cherished tunes. And he complains that once he retires, it's over. He can no longer do this kind of collection because he doesn't have the authority of the badge. And this to me is it's a huge job. It's a magnificent job that he pulls off because he's got these tunes. And what's the difference between what's a distinct tune and what's just a variation on another tune? That's hard to answer. Right? Where does one tune end and another begin? And what this tune seems to be the A tune, the A part of that tune, and the B part of another tune. Should we call it a distinct tune? And then there are a lot of tunes that are inflected by the United States. Irish Americans are very heavily involved in the minstrel show. And O'Neill was very interested in whether or not common minstrel show tunes were in fact Irish tunes, like the Turkey in the Straw. Was that an Irish tune? He thought it was. So if you encountered a tune that was Irishy, but also Yankee, what would you do with it? Well, maybe you would rewrite it to purge it of its Yankee influences, which he does. So it's not strictly collecting, it's also an act of shaping. And it's similar to this. Are these the same tune or not? Right? Are they the same tune or are they variations? Are they different tunes? This is a fascinating one where he reverse engineered a tune from a phrase he remembered his mother singing. I think the other sort of poignant thing is that this is an attempt to grapple with the legacy of displacement. This is a person displaced from his homeland, thriving in the United States. He has 3 houses. You know, he's doing very well. He's quite wealthy, I'm sure, entirely through above board and honest means, but no doubt. But it's a relationship with the immigrant's memory of Ireland, and it's an act of creating culture. It takes place in this sort of hothouse of American ethnic performativity. I'll go ahead a little bit to the Irish villages. Yeah, there's the 2 competing Irish villages, and the 3/4 scale Blarney Castle. When at one point, this is Lady Aberdeen is in charge of this, and her husband is coming, and she says, "Well, he's an official of the British government. I have to hoist the Union Jack." And twice, mobs of Chicago Irish Americans break into Blarney Castle and tear the flag down and throw it to the streets. And the police try to haul them away, but the crowd won't let them haul it away. There's lots of anecdotes like that. In Donahue's poem, no one will escape being recorded as a person. That is, being literally embodied, his body imprisoned in a bureaucratic record of his identity, if he allows his tunes to be alienated from himself and recorded in O'Neill's books. You could say, you know, if you want to be romantic about it, you could say in exchange for his soul, his body escapes. And I think that is what Donahue was trying to get at. And it's part of what I was trying to get at. And as I said, if I'd written the poem, I might never have bothered. It's not false, though. Donahue got that from an actual story O'Neill related in his book. This is an orphan kid, George West, who was working as a blacksmith's apprentice in the stockyards of Chicago. And one of his sergeants reported, "Hey, there's this kid. He's a great fiddler. You ought to hear him." And O'Neill goes to hear the kid, and he's astonished. The kid doesn't even have a fiddle, so O'Neill gives him a fiddle, and he's great. And he said they learned 3 new tunes from him. One of them is the famous tune, "The Boys of Blue Hill," which Chicago musicians didn't know. And he had him under watchful surveillance. It was more satisfaction if he located a score of crooks. And he's going to bring him before the meeting of Irish Jig players at the auditorium. You get the quote. I'll do it later. The thing about George is that George didn't want to do that. He didn't really want to play Irish music for a bunch of old men celebrating a country he had never lived in. He wanted to play what O'Neill called shindig music. He's degenerated into a barroom or shindig fiddler. And he says, "Thus lived the careless but improvident Georgie until an incident in his life rendered a visit to the West necessary." That is, the police ran him out of town. He committed some sort of crime, and the police told him to get out of Dodge. like in Donaghy's poem. I have the language on that later. He referred to himself as somebody with a grasping and tenacious ear. And I think, you know, just imagine this guy shows up and you're an Irish musician. You're not wealthy. You're probably in the Irish working class. And he tells you, I'm collecting Irish tunes. And you're sort of say, what? Yeah, it's for a book I'm going to publish. You can't afford the book. You don't read music. You have no notion of Irish really in any line with what he has in mind. But he's wearing this uniform and he's telling you he wants his collection. That is a grasping and tenacious act. And here, this is from the book. This is a quote from the book. It might make it seem vaguely sinister or not vaguely sinister. And I think this is the key. They could hardly have done otherwise. Their efforts to standardize and fix music and extract it from its context and make it formal fit in with general efforts at reorganization and system building, like the standardization of time, which takes place in the 1880s, or the standardization of grain or lumber. It's a worldview based on the impulse to rationalize. It's a preeminently modern project. They focused on the anachronistic music of the pre-industrial rural poor, drawing from and building on the innovations of urban industrial life, no more or less sinister than industrial life itself. I'm pleased with myself for the ambiguity of that phrase. This is what his first book looked like. This is from O'Neill's Music of Ireland. It's not called The Music of Ireland collected by Francis O'Neill. It's called O'Neill's Music of Ireland with a picture of him in his uniform. And this is what they typically look like. They have an Irish title and they have a Celtoid font. Irish music it's also rendered in what's called ABC notation, which is used by people who can't read music. And it's just, you know, you play an E twice, play an F twice, play an E, play a D. It's just telling you what the note names are. And so people who can't read music will sometimes communicate tunes this way. It was developed in the 1970s specifically to make folk music machine readable. It was designed to make folk music susceptible to computer analysis. And the entire corpus of everything O'Neill collected, and really the entire corpus of Irish folk music, is now fully digitized and available for AI to begin to do its magic. And certainly, I have a colleague who says he can't wait to retire because he's terrified of AI. And my students are terrified of AI because they think it's going to take all the entry-level jobs. You know, that entry-level white-collar jobs are going to be taken by AI. But I want to play some examples of computer-generated Irish music.
So recently, I asked ChatGPT to create 2 brand new Irish traditional tunes for me. This is what it came up with.
Now, I know those of you who know something about Irish music are sitting there trying to figure out ways in which that's not authentic sounding. You're starting to go, that's not really legit, right? It sounds pretty legit to me. I might quibble with the way he plays it, of course, because that's part of the pleasure, quibbling. It's the point of being an academic. But it's fairly convincing when someone who knows the idiom plays it. And this is another guy who did a collection on SoundCloud of tunes which mixes computer-generated tunes and actual Irish tunes played in the canon. I'll just play some briefly. Ghana means no name. legitimately. So I think, again, do these sound convincing or not? I know a lot of people who are eager to say they don't and find ways in which they don't. I think they're convincing because the people who played them knew what they were doing. And so I end with this. A very grumpy looking Chief O'Neill, who would probably be mad at me for some of the things I've said. I think AI could be seen as that state of memory that I described. Like what the AI has is this cloud of possibility, which is what I'm doing when I'm sitting there trying to figure out. I mean, last night they played some tune and I swore it was a tune I know and I started playing it. And then they got into the second part and I realized I had no idea what I was doing. Oops, sorry. That's the cloud of possibility. Is it the cloud of possibility or is it its grotesque doppelganger? I can't decide. I think for me, and I want to find something positive about this. On the one hand, it's obvious and completely logical that the collecting work O'Neill did would end up as a corpus of machine readable information. It was part of the same rationalizing information collecting impulse that leads to computers. It's not a surprise at all. So what do we make of it in a context where AI is becoming more and more dominant? I think for me, it reinforces the value of actual music played in actual communities. The point is not the extracted tunes. The point is the experience of playing them, which AI can't quite reproduce. Not yet, anyway. And it focuses attention not on the tunes, but on the spontaneous of playing of tunes within a given stylistic idiom. And I want to give an example that I think gets at where I think O'Neill sort of went wrong. Not that he went, it's a magnificent accomplishment. He didn't really go wrong. How many tunes have I collected? None. So I don't really have that much grounds to criticize. But this is an interesting account of a guy named O'Malley, no relation that I know of, and his safari to find O'Malley in a poor district of Chicago with George West. O'Malley was his friend. And he doesn't want to see the police there. Of course they don't. These are poor people. They don't want the captain of police in their apartment. Nothing good can come of that. But he's friendly to the children. He gives them some coins. Beer appears. O'Malley was handicapped with the loss of one finger from his left hand, but he played like a house of fire. O'Neill never asks how he lost the finger. Was it an industrial accident? Was it some congenital defect? Not interested in that question. But O'Malley was a drinker. He seldom could handle the bow after midnight if drink was involved. And then his understudy, George West, would complete the engagement. And then we learn about thus lived the careless and prominent town of Georgie until an incident in his life rendered a trip to the far west advisable. My point is just here is rather than he discards this guy O'Malley because he doesn't have any unique tunes. There's nothing to extract. There's no artifact he can take away. There's nothing he can publish that's of value to him. An alternative way of collecting would be to go to those houses where O'Malley eked out a living and document those house dances, because this is the lived community of the very people that he extolled in his histories. That is the rural people who played this actual music. He doesn't see that. I think this is because he has the mentality of the cop. He's interested in precise identification. He's interested in making a lasting mnemonic record that endures across time. And he's interested in extracting something from an unruly people and making it ruly. So I'll mercifully stop there. I guess take any questions.
Yeah, Mike, thanks so much for a brilliant lecture. I'm sure there will be questions, so let's open it up to the floor. Anyone like to start? Yes, Murray.
Yeah, I just wondered if you have much contact with people in Ireland in this period. It's a period of a lot of revival of interest in all things Irish. So is he just really locating his activities in the US, or has he much contact with people of similar interests?
Well, he's seeing immigrants from Ireland every day. I mean, the police force is just a.
People say still living in Ireland.
He did have, after he published the book, he had much more contact because it put him in the community of international sort of folk collectors. And so he has more then. And his tone changes a little bit. He begins to distance himself from the unruly musicians. He's writing to like Alfred Percival Graves, for example, and you know, who's Robert Graves is his son. And he's distancing himself from the musicians. And it's at the same point that he begins to alienate himself from that community. He also overstated the degree to which he collected these tunes from regular people. A lot of them came from published manuscripts. There's a big collection called Ryan's Mammoth Collection, which was published in Boston of fiddle tunes. And it's now the Bible of old-time Appalachian fiddlers in America under a different name, but it's the same collection. He took about 250 tunes from that. And he was also always looking for old manuscripts. So he probably overstated the degree he got from live people on the streets. Did that answer the question? He does enter, and there's a great website by Scott Spencer that collected, O'Neill sent copies of his books to people he thought would be interested. And Spencer has collected the inscriptions he wrote. When people have an inscribed book, they sent pictures of it. So you can see his intellectual community. And it's an international community. Yeah.
Hi, Mike. I really enjoyed reading your book. And it was trying to be quite different than what I was expecting. I really like the theme of how tradition meets modernity. It's such a fascinating figure for exploring all of that. But one of the things which struck me is, this is the age of, as Marie mentioned, this is the age of kind of cultural revival. And a big drive behind the cultural revival is very political. And again, he broke all the stereotypes there. He wasn't what I kind of expected. So I was wondering if you could say something about his relationship to political nationalism. Because it seems to me like a lot of what kind of drives the intense interest in cultural authenticity is because it sort of proves the case for the nation.
Yes, right.
And indeed, some of our most famous political nationalists are actually primarily cultural nationalists.
Right. Like Hyde.
And they end up, for utilitarian reasons, they end up political nationalists, but really their interest is cultural.
Right.
So on one hand, he's fascinated in kind of culture, and he's fascinated in authenticity, but he doesn't seem to have the same kind of motivations in terms of nationalism. And my second kind of question or follow-on from that relates to how then, and I know a little about this from the book, but how does he respond to other musical forms from other kind of cultures? So, because what comes true in your book in really fascinating ways, there's a kind of a masking of the kind of the complex interactions of cultural forms, but it sort of goes on a journey in terms of where he ends up.
I think politically he's probably a Redmondite. I mean, he's a home ruler. He's very much an enthusiast of Douglas Hyde. He's cagey about his politics, which is smart. You don't want the chief of police mouthing off about Irish nationalism. Really, it's not a good move. I think he's innately kind of politically conservative, but very interested in culture. And he does talk about the musical genius of the Irish race. That's a stable thing. He's always despairing of Irish politicians for their windy oratory, but he returns to that a lot. He was initially interested in policing Irish music, I think, and taking out the contaminating influences of American life. I listened to some of you probably know the famous Michael Coleman recordings. He was a fiddler from Sligo, who lived in New York, and played in vaudeville houses. And I try to make the argument that music is inflected by vaudeville. It's performative in a way that it wouldn't have been in Ireland, and that Irish people heard that. That's what they were hearing. They were hearing the influence of vaudeville. And probably the influence of jazz. Some of those early records have like swing beats on the guitar. You can tell they're listening to American swing jazz. Later in his life, he becomes much more sort of Catholic in his musical taste, and you can find him praising the swing, the sense of swing. He uses that a lot. Before the swing era, he used the term swing. The sense of swing that you'd hear in some old time or Appalachian country fiddlers in America. And his last book was an attempt to kind of build a house of swing out of Irish and American traditions. There's another point I wanted to make there. I'm losing it now. I'll get back to it. I don't think did I answer that?
Yeah, I'm struck by his attitudes to black music. They surprise me again.
Yeah, there is a scrapbook. In his scrapbooks, there's a clipping praising American jazz specifically as the genius of America, which you wouldn't expect from a man who was so ride or die on Irish music. There's no evidence of narrow bigotry in his writing. Now, I don't know that is entirely the accurate story. I guess I would class him among the great romantic anti-modernists, who the whole generation of particularly, English and Americans who are often deeply involved in industrial innovation, but romantic about the Middle Ages or romantic about pastoral life. He's very much that kind of guy. When he sends a copy of his book to Henry Ford, for example, which is interesting to me because it was at the height of Ford's notorious anti-Semitism. You can't overstate the severity of Henry Ford's anti-Semitism. Hitler had a picture of Henry Ford in his office because he was so impressed with him. And O'Neill sent him a copy of one of his books. Now, why is that? There's nothing in his writing that suggests anti-Semitism, but there's lots of romantic anti-modernism. As you might know, Henry Ford devoted the last years of his life to collecting pre-industrial artifacts, and the artifacts of life that he had done more than anybody to destroy, you could say. So O'Neill's a little bit in that, but he is positive towards American jazz, which you wouldn't expect, because in Ireland there's a jazz panic coming, as you know.
Precisely why people prize cultural authenticity.
Right.
I'm confused by it.
Yeah, I think he is often disgusted by Irish Americans and by the Irish. You know, he's disgusted by what he says windy oratory and flattery, and he's a man of practical affairs, and he grows tired of that.
I really like this lecture because it reminded me of a custom. He was a pensions inspector in Ireland, in Coleraine, Sam Henry. Similar kind of bureaucratic affair. He uses the fact that he's close to the people, in this case, trying to find out if they are 80 or 70 years old or not. Before they have censuses, so they have to. I think they have to remember the Great Storm of 1845.
To be legitimate.
Or something like that.
That's really interesting.
I thought, figures. Have you come across many figures like that? State officials who are kind of shaping the narrative of the authentic folk.
The first biography of O'Neill is written by Brendan Brannock, who's he's a great collector of music, but he's a bureaucrat employed by the state. And Nicholas Carolyn wrote a biography of him, and Carolyn himself is a bureaucrat employed by the state. That is, he's a hero to people who are themselves engaged in collecting. And as I said, I think there's so much to admire in O'Neill, but I think I pointed out some of the other ways to think about it. There's a tension between the practice and the preservation, and that's not a surprise. People who collect Native American artifacts are often well-intentioned. The Native Americans are not always happy with the collecting.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. Apologies if you cover this in the book. I haven't read it yet, but there's obviously a really rich tradition of police music ensembles across the United States, and I wonder to what extent that Francis William connects with that. We talk about folk music primarily here. And you talked about how his influence here versus the United States. Can you talk about as to how he connects with these ongoing legacies, which I think are so connected to Irish America, places like Chicago, Boston?
He doesn't connect with folklorists like Child. He doesn't talk about the Child ballads, or Cecil Sharp, who's recording Appalachian ballads in roughly the same time. He doesn't talk about those people. If he knew about them, which I assume he did, he doesn't refer to them. He knows he's very much connected to other police forces, and he goes to Boston. After he retires, he makes a grand tour of the United States, visiting Irish communities, and often complains, again, because people won't share their tunes. They've got these tunes and they won't share them. He doesn't mention the ethnic record boom. Starting around World War I, the United States, American record producers figure out there's a market for ethnic records. So they've been recording like Swedish tunes, Italian tunes, Irish tunes, and putting them out on record, and they're very successful. And that's part of what the Michael Coleman records come out of. He doesn't pay any attention to that, which is odd because he was a pioneer in using records. I didn't mention that, but he's starting to record people on Edison cylinders, 1903, 1906, earlier, and some of those still exist. So it's part of his getting alienated from that community. By the end of his life, he's living most of his life he has a home on the coast of Mississippi on the Gulf, and he goes there in the winter. But he went back to Chicago multiple times to commemorate that Iroquois theater fire. His tomb, I thought, was interesting. He commissioned a very impressive tomb for himself, and the Chicago Irish flute player, Kevin Henry, would play a concert on the steps of the tomb. But there's nothing Irish on the tomb. There's no Irish iconography on it at all, which I thought was really surprising. I don't know if I answered that question well. He was connected. He was very aware of like Piper's Clubs in San Francisco, Piper's Clubs, and I was very aware of that. Yeah. Now, when he went back to Ireland in 1906, he went back for 9 weeks, I think. It was the first time he'd been back since he left. And he did a tour, he judged some competitions, pronounced himself extremely unimpressed with the state of Irish music. There is more and better music in any dance hall in Chicago than in all of Ireland, he said.
Thank you. I was wondering, you mentioned him playing when he kind of stuck off to play.
Yes.
Do you have any records of whether he actually kind of got joy from kind of being part of the musical community?
Yes.
Even if he's very separate,
he did get joy. He wrote about with great warmth about gatherings of his friends to play music. And that he didn't write with great warmth about people like O'Malley, but he wrote, the people he was gathering with were often his police subordinates, which is interesting. But he does write with great and genuine warmth. And he talks especially, and one of the great sort of poignancies in his life is he writes in his memoir about the working class community of Bridgeport and the mutuality of that community and how they exchange favors for each other. And somebody built him steps for his house and didn't take any money, just said, why don't you buy my wife a shawl? You know, just the mutuality. And then he says, but, you know, we built the house and I became a landlord and I got out from under rent. And he also got out from that community. And you can see that as he got wealth and position, he got more alienated from the warmth of those communities. And by the end of his life, his earlier collaborators are really not talking to him anymore. You know, and partly because I think he tended to bully them a little. There's a woman named Selena O'Neill, again, no relation, who was a schooled fiddler. And he wrote effusive dedications to her in books, which are effusive enough to raise eyebrows. I mean, he was in his 60s at that point, and she was in her 20s. I don't think he would do anything totally untoward, but she may have feigned deafness to stop having to work with him. Because he writes 3 times in letters that she's totally deaf and you can't even talk to her anymore. But then she's recording tunes well after that time. And you can find her enlisted as a music teacher in Chicago well into the 40s and 50s. And you can find pictures of her and there's no hearing aids or any evidence of deafness. So it's very tempting to conclude that this is the only way she could gracefully escape this guy with his grasping and tenacious ear.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you finally. Wonderful book.
We've had a lot of email exchanges.
Well, I have a maybe half-baked comment about the dichotomy between unruly and rule.
Yeah.
So I take you up. Right. You say that the music and tradition playing it is unruly. It's this cloud of possibilities.
Yeah.
Anything can happen.
Right.
Critique, if you will, of O'Neill is that he wants to, as he's gone in other aspects of his career, systematize it, collect it, get it, preserve it forever.
Right. Embalm it, he said, often embalm it, yeah.
And of course, it's not the only collector.
He's following it.
Just along the line.
Right.
The same attitude to the people that they're collecting.
That's right.
Going back to here in town here in 1792.
Right.
But I wouldn't. I would say about the music that it's unruly because there is cognitively, and I'm out of my lane here, but musically, I'm in my lane there. It's highly structured.
Yes.
And quite simply structured of necessity because it's an oral tradition.
Right.
And it's what we're talking about for the most part is dance music, which
right.
is
it has to be highly structured.
you
right.
can see it. You can see it on the page.
Mm-hmm.
The 8-bar structure, and the A and the B part, and C and D and E for small minority. So the reason that it's so unruly, I would suggest, and the reason that a guy could be put under pressure to
make it ruleful,
play a tune for Francis, and then not play it the same way twice, maybe be incapable of playing it the same way. The reason for that unruliness is this structure.
Yeah.
This cognitive structure.
No, that's
so he kind of gets it like others wrong. This obsessive compulsion to collect every tune out there. Many of them useless.
Yeah. Right.
And your last point is exactly spot on. This obsession sort of supplants what should have been documented,
right.
That all the opportunities that were had to document the actual performance context. And there's so little about that.
I should probably be, I think.
So just to finish, Michael,
no, sorry.
We're not concerned about it. Let the AI run amok. Look at since Francis O'Neill's publications, I have a shelf of books of original compositions by dedicated composers of his carols, 100 tunes.
Right.
There's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. 80-90% of them are useless.
Right.
And
that's
this
true.
will continue with AI.
Yeah.
And we'll play the ones we like.
Right.
It's not
That's not a problem. I think it's not a problem. I think, and I probably should have made a better distinction between customary and ruleful. It's not that it's some disorganized, chaotic mess. It's that it's governed by custom, and custom would include how to play for certain kinds of dances, but most of those aren't written down. And that's a standard description in folklore between custom and law, or custom and rule. But you're absolutely right. Most of those tunes, most of the new compositions are discarded unless people like them.
And to his, what is your term, emotional obtuseness?
Yes.
Maybe he just didn't get it. You know,
Yeah.
Not a session there.
There's something poignant about his emotional reserve and his not talking about the deaths of his children. And there's something poignant about the fact that his friends all. So at one point he destroys a whole edition of the dance music of Ireland at great personal expense. He paid for the publication of all these books because his daughter told him that the key signatures were wrong. His daughter had some formal piano training. And the two men who helped him put those together were James O'Neill, the Belfast fiddler, and a man named Edward Cronin, who is you can hear him on record. He's an excellent fiddle player with a very distinctive style. And he got mad at them and told them, you got the keys wrong. And I'm sure they were thinking, who the hell made the chief's daughter the boss of Irish music? Like, these guys who have been playing Irish music their whole life, why are they having to take orders from her? And they both stopped working with him after that. And you can see why. He wants to be correct and he wants it to be systematized. And lots of Irish music really isn't in a key. It's in a mode, right? It's not really, key doesn't really quite work. But his daughter needs the accidentals to line up with the key signature they put in there. I'm sure Edward Cronin just played it however he wanted. He didn't think about the key signature. He was a good musician, but he wasn't a formally trained musician. But they both stopped working with him. And then he turned to Selina O'Neill, who feigned deafness, to stop working with him.
Great. Do we have any other questions? No, everyone happy? Well,
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was great. Thank you very, very much.
So, just a reminder again, if you want to follow this up, Mike's book, The Beat Cop, absolutely wonderful text, really important text as well, as you've heard tonight. Supported by a website as well, so thebeatcop.com
right.
is where you'll find links to music and publications, further information as well. So thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome. The next book, this is a fact. The next book is that I'm legally a black man in the state of Virginia, because the book started from two ancestors, one born in Donegal, who were declared to be colored by the state of Virginia. And the law in Virginia said that anyone with any ascertainable trace of African ancestry is a black person. It's referred to as the one-drop rule, and it was scrupulously enforced. And had my family stayed in Virginia, they didn't, my father would not have been able to legally marry my mother, because he would have been regarded as a black person. And both this guy from Donegal and his wife, who was Ulster Scott, were declared as black. I know exactly when it happened, and I know exactly who did it, but I still don't know why.
So that looks out in November.
That's November, yeah.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming. So we have some refreshments just outside in the Canada room.
Yeah.
You can stay and have a drink. That would be great.